They said the first light appeared at 12:03, not lantern light, but the trembling kind born of a single candle, carried by a pale hand that should never have been there. On the nights when the fog crept from the bayou and pressed against the slave cabins like a living thing, someone always saw her, a white figure in silk, barefoot in the mud, moving between the shacks like she was searching for something she'd lost. At first, they whispered that it was the senator's wife, Eleanor Voss. Then they whispered something worse, that she wasn't lost at all, that she knew exactly where she was going. No one in St. Martin Parish dared to speak her name after the scandal. The official story, written in the Baton Rouge Courier, said Mrs. Voss fell ill and was sent north for rest. But those who lived on the property remembered the screams, muffled, cut short and buried under the sound of thunder that same night. The next morning, the senator's coach was gone. His wife was gone. And in the quarters, one of the slaves, a man named Isaiah, was found hanging from the pecan tree near the stables. His body was untouched by lightning. Only the senator's riding crop was found at his feet. For years, the people of the parish avoided that land. They said you could still smell magnolia and iron there, that the house never stayed quiet after midnight. But what truly happened that night, what drove a respected woman of high society to cross into the forbidden part of her own plantation, was never printed. Only fragments remained. Her letters, sealed by the state, testimonies taken in secret, and a diary discovered decades later in the attic of a courthouse, its pages warped by moisture and guilt. Those pages tell a story that no one was meant to read, a story of desire, punishment, and the quiet madness of power unchecked. The Voss plantation was known not for its size but for its silence. The great house, with its colonnaded porch and rotting shutters, stood on a rise above the cane fields, high enough for the senator to look down upon everything he owned. They said even the birds avoided the place after dusk. Inside, the air was always heavy, perfumed with camphor and decay. Senator Augustus Voss was a man of law, order, and appearances. He sat on committees that wrote morality into statute, that dictated which souls were free and which were born to serve. In public, he was the embodiment of restraint. In private, restraint was what he most despised. The slaves feared his temper. His wife feared his silence. Eleanor's room was on the east side, facing the quarters. The window remained unlatched, even in the storm season. Servants claimed they saw her standing there at night, unmoving, her nightgown clinging to her frame, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the distant cabins. The senator forbade her from entering the fields. He said the law of the land was the law of God, and that the hierarchy of skin and station was divine. But in that house the law bent around the will of one man. The corridors were long, dim, and lined with mirrors that caught fragments of her, the back of her neck, the trembling of her hands, the bruise once hidden by lace. No one spoke of the locked cellar beneath the dining room. No one mentioned the strange hours when the senator's study remained lit, or the muffled cries mistaken for wind. Eleanor began writing then, letters she never sent. In them she confessed to nothing, yet implied everything. I have begun to see myself through his eyes. I am becoming what he believes I am. What she meant by that no one knew. But every sentence carried the sense of a woman watching herself disappear, piece by piece, in a house that worshipped control and punished feeling. Isaiah was not born on the Voss plantation. He was bought. The senator acquired him in 1849 from an estate in Pointe Coupée, a skilled carpenter, the bill of sale read, and of strong moral disposition. What it didn't say was that Isaiah carried silence like a scar. He spoke little, prayed often, and never lifted his eyes when the white men addressed him. But those who worked beside him said there was something unbroken behind his calm. He built the benches for the plantation chapel, the cane presses, the fence that separated the main house from the quarters. Eleanor often watched him from her window unseen as he worked in the fields. There was precision in his movements, a grace that unsettled her. She had not seen grace in years. It was during one of the senator's absences, a political trip to New Orleans, that Eleanor first stepped beyond the veranda. Rain had soaked the ground and the scent of earth rose thick around her. She claimed she was inspecting repairs to the chapel, but the truth was simpler. She wanted to be near something that wasn't afraid of her. Isaiah did not speak when she approached. He only removed his hat, his eyes fixed on the ground. Eleanor asked if he believed in forgiveness. He answered after a pause, "For who, ma'am? The one who sins or the one who suffers?" No one knew of that conversation. No one saw her return from the quarters that night. But in the days that followed, servants noticed her restlessness. She stopped eating. Her hands trembled when she poured tea. The senator, upon his return, found her standing in the rain again, not looking at him but at the cabins below. Something had shifted. The house, once obedient, now carried whispers between its walls. And in the quarters, Isaiah began to carve something out of wood. A figure small enough to fit in a child's palm, shaped like a woman looking away. They said the air changed before the storm ever came. The dogs grew restless, snapping at shadows. The women in the quarters kept their children close, whispering that something wicked had moved into the house. Not a spirit, but an idea. Ideas were more dangerous. They could not be whipped nor buried. Eleanor's visits became a secret the enslaved tried not to see. She came always after midnight, barefoot, her candle trembling against the wind. She never spoke above a whisper and never stayed long. Some thought she brought medicine. Others thought she came to confess. Isaiah stopped praying aloud. He worked harder, faster, as if trying to atone for something only he and she understood. The older men warned him, "A white woman's sorrow can kill quicker than a master's rage." But Isaiah said nothing. The carving he'd made, that little wooden figure, vanished from his shelf one night. The senator, meanwhile, sensed what the house refused to tell him. He smelled absence, the faint perfume on his wife's shawl, the damp prints on the kitchen floor where she should never have walked. One evening he asked the overseer if the slaves had been leaving their cabins at night. The overseer lied, as all men do when power is watching. After that, the punishments began again. The lash returned to the fields, and with it the echo of old control. The house brightened with forced prayer and false laughter, yet in every corner the silence held its breath. One morning Eleanor awoke to find a gift upon her dresser. The wooden figure, crudely carved but delicate in its posture. Its hands were clasped. Its face was turned away. Beneath it, in faint pencil marks, one word: forgive. She locked it in her drawer. That night she dreamt of water, of drowning without struggle, of a voice whispering from beneath the riverbed. You are not the one who suffers. You are the one who sees. And for the first time, Eleanor wished she could unsee. By the winter of 1853, the senator's law extended beyond the courthouse. It ruled every breath within the Voss estate. He believed discipline was divine, that fear was the spine of obedience. What he could not command through worship, he enforced through silence. Each morning the house rose to the sound of the bell. The servants lined the hallway, heads bowed, as Augustus Voss read aloud from the Book of Romans. His voice was steady, practiced, and hollow. The words had long stopped meaning anything. They were simply a rhythm to remind the house that he alone decided what was sin. Eleanor sat at the end of the table, pale and still, her eyes unfocused. The senator watched her the way a warden studies a prisoner who has learned to smile. Her defiance was quiet, but it existed, and that was intolerable. He forbade her from visiting the chapel. He locked her letters in a desk drawer, and when she spoke, he interrupted her mid-sentence, correcting her grammar like a misbehaving child. In the quarters, Isaiah was summoned to repair the study door. While he worked, he could feel the senator's eyes on him, the weight of judgment disguised as civility. You were a preacher's boy once, the senator said. Do you still believe the Lord sees all things? Isaiah nodded, though he did not look up. Then you know, Voss continued, that he sees what's hidden in a man's heart. That night the overseer dragged Isaiah from his cabin for questioning. The pretense was theft, a missing trinket, a meaningless lie. But everyone knew the truth. The master's suspicions had become blood-deep. From her room above, Eleanor heard the cries. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound found her anyway, not through walls but through memory. When the house finally fell silent, she opened the drawer and took out the wooden figure. It was warm to the touch, though no one had touched it for days, and for the first time she prayed. Not for Isaiah, not for herself, but that her husband might never discover what he was truly capable of. Rain came that spring without mercy. The bayou swelled, swallowing fences and graves. Mold crept up the walls of the great house, softening the edges of portraits that once smiled with pride. The servants whispered that the land itself had grown tired of obedience. Eleanor wandered the halls alone. Her husband had traveled again, a legislative retreat in Baton Rouge, though everyone knew retreat was a word men like him used to disguise indulgence. The emptiness of the house gave her courage. She began to open doors that had always remained closed. Behind the study wall, concealed by a warped panel of wood, she found a drawer of ledgers. Each was dated, organized, precise, the senator's handwriting like iron nails. The entries were brief but devastating. Names, punishments, reasons: April 2nd, theft of sugar. 20 lashes. May 10, insolence. 2 days in the pit. June 18th, disobedience, female. Relocated to the attic. But farther back the ink grew darker and the entries less official. These were not records for the overseer. They were confessions. Each name was followed by a single sentence, sometimes written twice, sometimes underlined, as though to convince himself of its truth. Sin must be remembered to be erased. Mercy invites decay. She looks at me the way they do. Eleanor realized the handwriting in those final lines had begun to change. The script trembled, almost feminine. She traced the letters with her finger and felt the ache of recognition. Her husband hadn't simply documented the lives he owned. He'd absorbed them. Every punishment was a sermon, every wound a verse in his private gospel. The law he spoke in public was born of the crimes he performed in private. That night Eleanor could not sleep. She dreamed of ink spreading across her own hands, her name appearing in the ledger's margins as if it had always been there. When she awoke, the candle beside her bed had burned down to its wick, and the drawer where she'd hidden the ledger was open. She hadn't opened it. The staircase to the attic was narrow and airless, built for servants and storage. Dust lay thick as ash on every step. No one had gone up there in years, not since the senator ordered it locked after an unfortunate incident. Eleanor carried only a single candle. The flame bent in the draft as if resisting the climb. Each step creaked like something exhaling. When she reached the top, she paused before the door. The lock was old but broken. Someone had forced it long ago. She pushed gently and the door gave way with a sigh. The smell struck first: iron, old linen, and something faintly sweet, like dried fruit left too long in the heat. In the corner stood a narrow cot, its mattress sagging under its own weight. Chains hung from the beam above, not rusted but polished smooth by use. On the wall, a single mark repeated again and again. A small cross scratched into the plaster, hundreds of times over, until the shape had eaten through the surface. She knelt beside the cot and found something beneath the straw. A strip of blue ribbon, faded and torn. She remembered it. It was the kind once tied around the wrists of servant girls on holy days. A token of obedience. Her hands began to shake. She thought she heard movement, the soft scuff of a foot behind her. But when she turned, the room was still. The candlelight flickered across the crosses, and for an instant, she imagined they were eyes. Eleanor left the attic before dawn. She washed her hands 3 times, but the smell of iron clung to her skin. That night she tore a page from her husband's ledger and burned it in the hearth. The flame hissed blue as if the ink itself refused to die. In her next letter, unsent as always, and she wrote, "He built his own confessional, and I have entered it. There are no priests here, only witnesses." The carriage wheels were heard before dawn, a slow grind on wet gravel that set the dogs barking. The senator had returned 3 days early. Servants scattered like startled birds, clearing the parlor, relighting the lamps, preparing the mask of normalcy that always preceded his arrival. Eleanor stood at the top of the stairs, frozen. The smell of tobacco and bay rum reached her before his voice did. He greeted no one. The only sound was the heavy click of his boots against the marble floor. When he finally looked up, his expression carried neither warmth nor surprise. "Only study. Did you keep the house?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, too slowly. "I heard there were storms." They ate breakfast in silence. The clock ticked. Rain pattered on the windows like fingers testing for weakness. When the senator reached for his coffee, his cuff brushed the edge of her sleeve and she flinched. It was small, involuntary, but enough. His eyes lifted to hers and something changed behind them. That evening he entered his study and found the hidden drawer ajar. The ledgers were still there, but one was missing. Eleanor watched from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat as he turned the desk over, his movements deliberate, soundless. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, careful and terrifyingly calm. "Some things in this house have lost their place." That night the lamps in the quarters burned later than usual. The overseer was summoned. Orders were given quietly without explanation. By midnight the house had gone still again, though everyone inside felt the air tremble like before a storm. Eleanor sat at her mirror, the candle guttering beside her. She took the wooden figure from its drawer and studied it. The carved woman's face was still turned away, but now in the wavering light it looked as if she were listening. From the corridor came the soft click of a lock. The senator had closed her door. From the outside. The first thing Eleanor noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary kind, but the manufactured stillness of a house holding its breath. The door to her room, locked from the outside, no longer rattled when she tried it. The window shutters had been nailed shut. The world beyond had disappeared behind a skin of wood. She called for the maid, softly at first, then louder. No one came. By noon she heard movement in the hallway. Boots, a tray set down, the click of metal against porcelain. But when she spoke, the footsteps retreated. Someone was there. Someone who had been told not to answer. The senator's method was always order disguised as mercy. He sent her food. He left books by the door, though she had no light to read them. He spoke to her only once that first evening. His voice filtered through the paneling. "You will rest now, Eleanor. You've been unwell. That was the word used for women who remembered too much. By the third night the candle burned out. She began to measure time by sound. The tolling of the courtyard bell, the shuffling below when meals were served to others. She learned which creaks in the floor belonged to the senator, and which to Isaiah, who still passed by in silence, his presence a secret kindness. Then the scratching began. Faint, rhythmic, just beyond the wall near her bed. At first she thought it was rats, but the pattern was too deliberate. 3 short strokes, a pause, then 2 longer ones. She pressed her ear to the wood and whispered, "Who's there?" The scratching stopped. Later that night she found a folded scrap of paper pushed through the floorboard seam. It was torn from the ledger. On it a line written in unfamiliar ink. "They never stopped writing your name." She wanted to cry, but no sound came. Only the faint echo of the lock turning again. And this time, she realized, it hadn't been locked to keep her safe. It had been locked to keep her quiet. On the 5th night, the scratching returned, faster, urgent, like someone digging through memory itself. Eleanor pressed her ear to the wall again, heart hammering. The rhythm came in bursts now, almost like speech. She whispered, "I can hear you." And this time the noise paused, then resumed, slower, deliberate, answering her with the same 5-beat pattern. 3 short, 2 long. 3 short, 2 long, a signal. She tore away a loose plank near the baseboard and found a hollow space between her room and the servants' corridor. Narrow, dust-choked, and lined with forgotten relics. There were scraps of paper, bits of fabric, and, at the far end, a small hole no larger than a coin. Through it she saw faint candlelight. A voice came through, low and steady. "Don't speak loud, ma'am. He listens through the vents." It was Isaiah, he told her in fragments, each word separated by silence. The senator had always kept records, not for justice but for pleasure. Every punishment, every transgression, every humiliation. His law was performance, his cruelty a ritual meant to confirm his own righteousness. The ledger she'd found was only one of many. The rest were hidden beneath the chapel floor, guarded by the overseer who feared him like a god. Eleanor asked why Isaiah risked speaking to her. His answer was almost a whisper. "Because you're in there for us too. He thinks keeping you locked makes us forget what he's done. But the house remembers, and—" She pressed her hand to the wall, feeling warmth radiate from the other side. Not comfort, but shared terror. When Isaiah's candle finally went dark, she sat alone in the shadows, tracing the pattern of the scratches with her fingertips. 3 short, 2 long. Not just a signal, she realized, a name. A rhythm of survival passed from one unseen prisoner to another. For the first time since her confinement, Eleanor no longer feared the silence. She understood it now. Silence was how truth spoke when truth was forbidden. The chapel stood at the edge of the property, half hidden by cypress and rot. From a distance it looked abandoned, its steeple split by lightning, its bell long gone. But Eleanor remembered what Isaiah had said. The rest are hidden beneath the chapel floor. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and candle soot. When she reached the chapel door, she found it unlatched. The hinges wailed as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick and sour, like the breath of something long confined. The pews Isaiah had built years before were still there, their varnish dulled by mildew. A Bible lay open on the pulpit, its pages fused together by damp. In the silence, she could almost hear sermons echoing. The senator's voice preaching virtue over blood-stained boards. She searched the floor for any sign of a loose plank. Beneath the 3rd row, she found it, a section of wood cut with surgical precision, the edges worn by use. She pried it open with a rusted candlestick and felt cold air rush upward from below. A ladder descended into darkness. The space beneath was small, barely tall enough to stand. Shelves lined the walls, each stacked with ledgers bound in leather. Dozens of them. Hundreds, perhaps. Their spines were marked with initials, dates, and single words. Defiance, temptation, mercy. She opened one at random. Inside were drawings, not words. Faces rendered in ink, distorted and frantic as if captured mid-scream. Each page bore the same signature. A.V. Augustus Voss hadn't simply documented his rule. He had illustrated it. Page by page, he'd turned suffering into art. Eleanor clutched the book to her chest, trembling. The candlelight flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement. Among the shelves, the faint shift of paper. Breathing. Then she heard footsteps above, measured, unhurried, coming. Closer to the pulpit. She blew out the candle and crouched in the dark, heart pounding against the ledger. Above her, the floorboards creaked once, twice, then a voice. "Eleanor," the senator said softly, "you shouldn't be here." Eleanor froze beneath the floor. Dust fell like ash through the cracks above her head. The senator's boots moved slowly up the aisle, the deliberate cadence of a man who already knew the ending. "You've been wandering," he said. His tone was calm, practiced, the same voice he used in court. "Curiosity is a dangerous appetite, my dear. It turns obedience into pride." She held her breath as he reached the pulpit. Through a sliver in the floorboards, she could see the hem of his coat. He rested a hand on the Bible. "Do you know why I built this chapel?" he asked. "Because even God needs an audience. Otherwise his mercy is wasted. He opened the book and began to read, though the words were his own invention. And the Lord said unto man, Discipline is the proof of love, and silence the proof of grace. His voice deepened, trembling with fervor. But some cannot accept grace. They resist correction. They wander in the dark and call it freedom. Eleanor clutched the ledger tighter. Her pulse echoed in her ears. He paused, lowering his voice. You've been writing letters again. Her stomach turned. I found one, he continued. Not addressed, not sent. Such pity for a man who has done nothing but protect you from yourself. She heard the Bible close, the hollow thud of final judgment. The law is not a cruelty, Eleanor. It's a kindness. It keeps chaos outside our door. Then came the whisper she would remember for the rest of her life. But sometimes the chaos is already inside. The boards above her creaked. His boots turned. The chapel door shut with a sound like thunder. Eleanor stayed hidden long after he'd gone, shaking, her fingers blackened by ink and dust. When she finally climbed back into the night air, dawn was breaking. In her hand she carried one page torn from the ledger. Across it, written in a trembling scrawl not her husband's, were 4 words that made her blood run cold. Help me. Still here. Eleanor read the message again by morning light. Help me. Still here. The ink had bled into the paper, forming veins that looked almost alive. It wasn't Isaiah's handwriting, nor the senator's. The letters were delicate, uncertain, the writing of a woman. She hid the page beneath her bodice and returned to the house through the servants' passage, careful not to be seen. The corridor seemed longer now, warped by fatigue and fear. Every door she passed whispered with the sound of drafts like shallow breathing. In her room she listened. The house was never silent anymore. Beneath the floorboards behind the walls there were murmurs, faint, layered, too soft to understand. Sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping. They came in patterns like prayers half remembered. She began tracing them, moving from room to room, pressing her ear to plaster. Near the east wing she found one voice clearer than the rest. A woman's hum, low and steady, repeating the same melody over and over. It was the tune played during Sunday sermons. She followed it to a locked linen closet. Inside, the sound stopped. On the top shelf lay folded linens and a small book wrapped in burlap. She unwrapped it carefully. It wasn't a Bible. It was a journal, pages brittle with age, filled with slanted handwriting. The first entry was dated May 18, 1841. He says the punishment is holy. He says pain cleans the heart. I no longer pray aloud, the walls do it for me. The entries continued for months. The name signed at the bottom of each page, Celeste. Eleanor remembered the name from one of the ledgers, June 18th, disobedience, female. Relocated to the attic. A chill ran through her. Celeste had written those words in the same house, perhaps in the same room. Outside, thunder rolled again over the bayou. The air thickened, pressing down like a held breath. Eleanor turned to the window and caught her reflection in the glass. But behind it, faint and trembling, another face looked back. The same eyes. The same mouth. The same plea, help me. Still here. The next morning, the air was different, heavier, almost sentient. The plantation seemed to breathe in rhythm with her, the shutters groaning, the floors sighing beneath her bare feet. Every sound carried intent. Eleanor walked the halls like a trespasser. The portraits watched her again, eyes glinting through dust, oil, and time. Her husband's ancestors stared with that same solemn cruelty that had been painted to look like piety. The house did not forget its builders. She carried Celeste's journal under her shawl, reading fragments whenever she could. The words were not merely memories. They were warnings. He takes them below the chapel. He says it's where light cannot tempt the flesh. He says no one hears a soul once it has been offered. Below the chapel. The thought pressed against her mind until it became unbearable. That night, while the senator slept, she lit a single taper and crept back to the chapel's rear wall. She found the trap door she'd seen the slaves use to carry coal. It groaned when she lifted it. Beneath was a narrow stairwell spiraling into earth. Each step downward made the flame tremble. The walls dripped with condensation, the air thick with mildew and the faint iron scent of something older. Blood, maybe, or rust. At the bottom, she found a small chamber carved into clay. Shackles lined the walls. On a rotted table sat a crucifix warped and blackened by smoke. Under it, a dozen tiny glass jars filled with something dark and gelatinous. She lifted one toward the light. Inside, suspended like a forgotten relic, was what looked like a lock of human hair. On the wall beside it, words were scratched into plaster. If the body is silenced, the house shall speak. The candle flickered violently. The whisper came again, close now. Just behind her ear, soft as breath. Still here. Eleanor turned, but there was no one there. Only the sound of the house exhaling. Slow, deliberate, patient. Eleanor raised the candle higher, her pulse quickening as the chamber widened before her. The walls were no longer bare clay. They had been carved meticulously, with Latin inscriptions: peccatum, purificatio, sacrificium, sin, purification, sacrifice. At the center stood a wooden cross, blackened at its base as if scorched by years of fire. A rusted chain hung from one arm. Beneath it, a circle of stones formed a crude altar, still stained in places too dark to name. The air pulsed. It wasn't silence, and it was a vibration, deep and rhythmic like a heartbeat in the earth. Eleanor's candle sputtered. The shadows around her moved even when she didn't. On the far wall hung more jars, each labeled with a single name: Celeste, Ruth, Miriam, Abel. Names she'd seen in the ledger. Names her husband had crossed out. She touched one jar. The glass was cold, but inside the substance seemed to move as if stirred by her presence. The whisper returned, echoing faintly through the walls, not one voice now, but many. Help us, help us, help us. She stumbled backward, her candlelight catching a wooden chest near the altar. Inside were scraps of paper, prayers written in different hands. The ink had run, words dissolved, but one remained clear enough to read. He says the blood keeps the land from turning against him. He says the screams make the crops grow. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She imagined her husband standing where she stood, reciting verses while lives were extinguished below the chapel. The sermons, the blessings, the prosperity, all built on this ritual. Something shifted behind her. A breath, a step, a sigh. She spun around, holding the candle close, and for a moment she saw them. Dozens of figures, pale and translucent, emerging from the walls like fog. Eyes hollow, hands reaching. Their mouths moved, but no sound escaped. The candle died. In total darkness, Eleanor heard only the senator's voice above her, faint through the chapel floor. Lord, forgive us our trespasses. Eleanor awoke in darkness. The air was damp and tasted of copper. Her hands groped blindly until they found the extinguished candle, still warm at its base. She had fainted, but for how long she couldn't tell. The chamber felt different now, closer, breathing. Something brushed her ankle. She jerked back, heart pounding, only to see the wall ahead shimmer faintly as if the clay itself were sweating. Slowly, forms began to take shape within it. Soft protrusions, the vague outlines of faces pushing through the surface like figures trapped beneath ice. Eyes, noses, open mouths frozen mid-scream. She stumbled backward, but the wall behind her shifted too, clay rippling under her touch like flesh. A whisper rose from every corner of the room, the same plea repeating endlessly. Still here. Still here. Still here. Eleanor pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound came from inside her skull now, vibrating her teeth, echoing behind her eyes. She began to mutter fragments of prayer, the only defense she could summon. But the words faltered, collapsing into sobs. In the flickering dark, one of the faces pushed further forward until its lips nearly broke the surface. The mouth moved. The voice was faint but unmistakable. "He said you would free us." Eleanor's knees buckled. "How?" she whispered. "Tell me how." "Burn the chapel," came the answer, layered, dissonant, a chorus made of hundreds of overlapping voices. The ground must remember the fire. The floor shuddered. Dust fell from the beams. From above, faint footsteps crossed the chapel. The senator was awake. Eleanor looked up toward the trapdoor, her face streaked with sweat and clay. She realized she couldn't leave without the journal, without proof of what had been done. But as she turned to retrieve it, the faces began to sink back into the walls, their eyes closing one by one. Only a single whisper lingered in the air, fragile and mournful. "If you do not burn it, it will burn you." Eleanor emerged from the trapdoor like a revenant covered in dirt and half-mad with terror. The chapel above was dark, lit only by the last embers in the hearth. Her husband stood near the altar, back turned, whispering a prayer that sounded more like command than devotion. "Forgive me, Lord," he murmured, "for the order of things must be preserved." She watched him for a long moment, her hands trembling. The candle stub still flickered in her grasp, the same flame that had guided her through the pit. He turned. Their eyes met. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you've been below." His calmness was worse than rage. "Do you know what you've done?" "Yes," she said. "I saw them." He stepped closer, his expression grave, almost pitying. "Then you understand why it must remain. Their pain bought everything we have, and the land, the harvest, the name. Without it, the earth would devour us." She took another step back, voice trembling. "No, Isaiah. The earth remembers. That's why it won't stop." He smiled faintly, as though speaking to a fevered child. "You always had a poet's heart. But the soil hungers for obedience, not poetry." He reached for her wrist, the same hand that had once caressed, now cold with restraint. "Put it out," he said, nodding toward the candle. Instead, she raised it higher. "I'm giving it back to them." Before he could move, she flung the flame onto the altar cloth. It caught instantly, racing across the wood like a living thing. Smoke filled the air, thick and sweet. The jars beneath the pulpit cracked one by one, spilling their dark contents onto the floor. Each pop like a scream freed. The senator lunged, but the fire rose between them, swallowing his voice. Eleanor backed toward the door, coughing, eyes streaming. From within the blaze, she saw faces forming in the smoke. Familiar, sorrowful, radiant. "Help me." "Still here." For the first time, the words didn't sound like despair. They sounded like release. By dawn, the plantation was gone. The chapel smoldered in silence, its steeple collapsed into a mound of blackened beams. The air was thick with the acrid sweetness of burnt cedar, and something else beneath it. Something older, like scorched marrow. Eleanor stood barefoot in the ash, her nightdress gray with soot. The senator's body had not been found. Only his ring, melted into the altar stone, remained. The wind stirred. It carried the faint hiss of the bayou beyond the fields, where fog hung low over the water. Somewhere beneath that mist, frogs croaked and insects began their morning songs. She should have felt free. Instead, she felt hollow, as if the fire had burned through her, too. The slaves' quarters had collapsed with the chapel, yet when she walked the perimeter, she found something strange. Perfect circles of untouched ground amid the ruin, patches where the fire hadn't touched, as though the earth itself had refused to consume those spaces. Kneeling, she brushed away the soot. Beneath her fingers, the soil pulsed faintly, warm as living flesh. A faint hum rose from it, not voices this time, but a single note, low and resonant. The land was breathing, remembering. She whispered, "It's over now." The hum deepened, almost sorrowful. A thin crack appeared in the earth, and from it seeped a thread of black water. The smell of iron filled the air again, blood or the memory of it. She stood trembling. Beyond the ruins, the bayou shimmered red in the early sun. Eleanor turned toward the plantation road. But as she took her first step, she saw them in the trees and pale outlines, motionless, watching her go. The freed souls of the house they did not follow. They simply stood, as if guarding what had been reclaimed. When she reached the gate, she looked back one final time. The wind carried a whisper through the ashes, soft, almost tender. Now it remembers. For 3 days, Eleanor did not sleep. She wandered the ruins, tending to the remaining servants who dared to stay. None spoke of the senator. They avoided her eyes, whispering that fire could not touch the truly damned. On the 4th night, the fog rolled in thick from the bayou, carrying the scent of charred wood and wet earth. She sat alone by the remnants of the chapel, the ring she'd found clenched in her palm. The air shifted. A faint scraping came from beneath the altar stone, or the same one fused with his ring. Her pulse quickened. The ground beneath her trembled slightly, then cracked. Ash billowed up, and for an instant she thought she saw fingers pushing through, pale, blackened, reaching for the air. Eleanor stumbled backward, whispering, "No. It's done. It's done." The wind rose, scattering ash into her hair. The fog thickened until it swallowed the horizon. From within that whiteness came a shape, tall, staggering, human. Each step left a print that hissed with smoke. He emerged into view, his skin streaked with soot, his face half burned but unmistakable. The senator. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the embers of a fire that no longer burned. "Eleanor," he rasped, voice brittle and hollow. "You freed them." She took another step back. "You're dead." He smiled faintly, the same gentle smile that once hid sermons and sin alike. "You burned the chapel, but the soil still remembers? The covenant was never mine alone." The ground beneath them began to pulse again, as if something vast and buried was awakening. The whisper of the freed voices returned, but this time it was not pleading. It was warning. He belongs to it now. The senator reached out a trembling hand. Ash fell from his fingertips like gray snow. "Come back below, Eleanor. The earth won't rest until it takes both of us." She turned and ran. Through smoke, through fog, through the wailing hum of the land itself. Until she reached the bayou. The water rippled red under the moonlight. Behind her the house exhaled, a deep guttural sigh, and then silence. The moon hung low over the bayou, a silver coin trembling on black water. Eleanor stood at its edge, chest heaving, hair tangled with ash. The cries of the night insects had gone silent. Even the frogs withheld their songs. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Behind her, the plantation's ruins glowed faintly like coals refusing to die. Somewhere in that slow-burning light, the senator moved. She could feel him, a presence carried by the wind. Not a man anymore, but something woven into the soil. The bayou rippled. The surface broke. Hands, pale and dripping, rose from the water, not to drag her under, but to beckon her closer. Faces emerged one by one, serene and hollow-eyed, Celeste among them. "You freed us," Celeste whispered, her voice barely touching the air. "But the land still binds him." Eleanor knelt at the bank. "How do I end it?" "Not end," Celeste said. "Return. Let the bayou remember you too." Eleanor looked down. The reflection that stared back was not her own. It was every woman who had vanished into this house, every voice that had whispered, "Help me." Their faces overlapped in the water, a living chorus of the past. Behind her, the ground shook. Smoke and soil rose together, forming the vague outline of the senator, still reaching, still pleading, or perhaps commanding. "Eleanor," his voice was fading, "don't leave me alone with them." She stepped into the water. It was warm, too warm, like breath against her skin. The surface closed around her slowly, the world muffling into silence. For a moment there was only darkness. Then deep below she opened her eyes. The faces were all around her, calm and waiting. She took Celeste's hand. Above them the bayou stilled. The plantation's last embers winked out. When dawn came, there was no trace of the chapel, No sign of the senator or his wife. Only ripples spreading across the water, and beneath them a faint hum, low, endless, alive. The bayou had remembered.